I see the evidence of your
Hey, good
good.
afternoon. Welcome back to Growing Deeper. This week is Ryan talking about John 3. So, if you can summarize for us what you talked about this week. Awesome. So Sunday, we looked at almost the whole chapter. There's so much to cover in John chapter 3 that we mainly focused on the front, on a conversation between Jesus and a guy named Nicodemus, a religious leader of the day, super smart. And he's actually going to come back up again in the gospel. So it's interesting that he's kind of brought up, and there's a conversation that they have. The second half of the chapter is this episode with John the Baptist and his followers, and them following Jesus. And so it's really interesting. But a way to kind of summarize what we looked at this Sunday, the sermon was entitled Whoever Believes. Three times in John chapter 3, there's this idea of whoever believes, and then there's a fill in the blank, has eternal life, is kind of the main language there. But I think we can kind of summarize the whole chapter, John chapter 3, with the very familiar verse of John 3:16, which says, "For God so loved the world, he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him will not perish, but have everlasting life." So that starts with "for God." It's actually a really great picture of the whole gospel because it starts off with that there is a God. And now we understand a little bit about him. For God so loved, he is a loving God. And we find out the object of his love, which is the world, that God loves humanity. He loves people. And how does he express that love? For God so loved the world that he gave. That one of the ways we define love and we understand our God is he's a generous giver. So the Father sends his Son. So again, thinking about whoever believes God so loved the world that he gave his only son. We're reminded that the only way for us to receive the promises of new life, of being born again, eternal life, being freed from condemnation is through the only son, through Jesus, which is an important thing to remind ourselves that there is only one way and his name is Jesus. So God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him, that the pathway to the promises we find in God are through belief in Jesus, trusting in Jesus, not just knowing things about him, but actually relying upon him. And when it comes to belief, John chapter 3 reminds us a few times that it's also God working in us to believe and the Spirit moving, and that's exciting. So John 3:16, God so loved the world that he gave his only son, that whoever believes in him will not perish, but have everlasting life. That John makes some stark contrasts between light and dark and things like to believe and not believe. If you believe, you have a life. If you don't believe, you find death and judgment. So that's kind of a summary of John chapter 3 in the verse John 3:16. Sweet. Tonight's was our theme of going deeper. What is something you would encourage us to go deeper in, or you wish you had time to go deeper in your sermon?
Yeah, as always, I wish I had at least an hour and a half to preach on Sunday mornings, but we don't. Well, maybe we could. No, we don't. No one wants that. But we didn't really have a lot of time to focus in on the second half, which is this conversation and this episode with John the Baptist. And there's some discussion and some people wondering about John's followers see Jesus baptizing people, and they're like, yo, this guy's baptizing people. What's going on? And John the Baptist makes it very clear that he has been coming to point to someone else, to point to Jesus. He comes and talks about this language that it is his joy in verse 30 or verse 29. Therefore, this joy of mine is now complete. He's had a mission and a purpose, and that is to point to somebody else, which is, I think, helpful for us as believers, that there's a great joy that comes when we don't live for ourselves. The culture says, the way that you find joy and fulfillment is to put yourself first and seek your own pleasure, seek your own joy. There's kind of this paradox when it comes to the Christian faith, that in losing our life, we find it. John discovered that in actually him kind of pointing to Jesus and getting out of the way is where he finds his joy, mission complete. And he has this language that he must increase, Jesus must increase, but I must decrease. If you want to find joy in life, it's about not about you. It's about increasing Jesus and your love for him and living for him, which is exciting. If we had more time, even with this whole idea of why is this in John's gospel, that perhaps the gospel writer John is writing to address an issue in the church that he was originally writing for, the original context, where some people were still like big fans of John the Baptist, and they need to realize that it's about Jesus. And so John reminds them in this gospel that Jesus is the one from heaven. He's the eternal one that speaks for God, full of the Spirit. Again, pointing to Jesus. It's all about him.
Awesome. All right. Well, obviously next week is John 4. So where do you see being the layout or the transition from 3 into 4?
I'm really excited for in John's gospel, there's all of these kind of pairs of things that are going on. And so there's going to be a contrast that sets up. And just so you know, Pastor Tony's preaching this Sunday. You want to be there. You want to bring your friend. You want to bring your friends' friends and strangers that you find because Pastor Tony's going to preach. But there's going to be this contrast between Nicodemus, religious leader, well known, has power, should know what's going on, but is imperceptive to the teachings of Jesus. And then John chapter 4, a Samaritan woman, an outsider, an outcast who perceives Jesus. And there's this contrast that's going to come. And so John chapter 3 and John chapter 4 are going to speak well to one another. And so I'm excited to hear as Pastor Tony unveils the text for us. Thanks for interviewing. We hope to see you this coming Sunday. If you need more information, check out our website at gbccalgary.com. And as always, go in grace.
See you then.
I see the evidence of your